Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very honored and privileged to be talking with John Milton Cooper. John is a famous historian and author. He has his bachelor's from Princeton University, and he has his PhD from Columbia. He has a long teaching career. He's taught at Wellesley College. He's taught at University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he is the Emeritus Professor there. He is the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship, Fulbright Professorship, and he is the author of many books. The one in which we talk about in this conversation is Woodrow Wilson, a Biography, in which that book was a finalist for the Pulitzer. In this conversation, we talk about everything concerning Woodrow Wilson. We start by talking about the impact of the South, racism, and living in the North for Wilson. We talk about why the practice of law was not suited for Wilson, how he's more academic and cerebral in many ways, and this transpires with his being a professor and being the president of Princeton. We talk about the importance of his book, Congressional Government. We talk about the infamous election of 1912, the first term successes of Wilson, Wilson's challenges with race while he was in office, why Wilson stayed out of World War I for such a long time, 14 points and League of Nations and his grand plan for global peace. We talk about some of the aspects of his physical health, namely his stroke at the end of his presidency, and what the legacy is of Wilson. It goes without saying, I think, that John is probably the world's greatest living scholar on Woodrow Wilson. He's dedicated much of his career to studying Wilson, and his book is absolutely fabulous. Small technical note, for some reason, my audio and his audio were not the best. I'm not sure what happened on my end or on his end. So it's a little bit lower than usual. I've done everything I can to try and boost it up. So apologies for some of the lower audio. Is one of the downsides of doing things virtual. Hopefully at some point be able to do these podcasts in person with guests. So you may need to turn your volume up to hear some of pieces where he's speaking, and maybe even for myself. So hopefully we won't have that issue any further. All that aside, it was really a big honor to talk with someone of John's caliber. I greatly enjoyed the conversation about a president. I really, really enjoy studying and thinking about his impact. And so hopefully this will be helpful for listeners out there to kind of reevaluate some of their thoughts on Wilson as well, and hopefully pick up John's wonderful book. And so now I bring you John Milton Cooper. I'm here with John Milton Cooper. John, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very excited to talk with you.
Glad to be here.
So first, just briefly, real quick, tell folks who you are and what you have done, what you're currently doing, and all the particulars.
I'm a retired history professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I have written most of my career about the World War I era, and a lot of it about Woodrow Wilson. Currently, I'm retired. I am working on a Wilson edition. Basically, what we're doing is boiling down the 69 volumes that Arthur Link edited down into one big fat volume with a few.
Wow!
So that's keeping me busy.
I mean, if that's what you're doing in retirement, my goodness, that sounds like a project.
Well, how's that help?
Yeah. That's wonderful. I mean, you are, by many people's accounts, the person on Woodrow Wilson. I mean, you are the man to talk to about Woodrow Wilson.
Anne-Marie Slaughter has done that to me twice. And the second time she did it, I said the only thing I could say in response was to quote a president named Wilson, but not Woodrow, Ronald Reagan. There you go again.
Well, I guess I want to get right into the book. So you wrote the book, Woodrow Wilson, which is, I think it's about 15 years old now, or coming up on it, somewhere around there, right?
13.
Yeah, yeah, it's a masterful book. I know it was a finalist for the Pulitzer, and it's a great book. So obviously, I want to mostly focus on the presidency of Wilson, but we'll just kind of talk about some of his background a little bit. I guess he was born right before the Civil War in the South, and so I guess the first question, and obviously it's a complicated issue with him a little bit. How much was the kind of vestiges of slavery and some of the racism in the South? How much was that kind of an impact on his personal development and how he, saw things in the world and policy?
That's interesting. I mean, he was indeed, as you say, born in the South on the eve of the Civil War, born in Stanton, Virginia, in the Valley of Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Moved to his father was a Presbyterian minister, and he got a new church in Augusta, Georgia, and moved there when he was just a year and a half old. And then from there, after the Civil War, his father went off for a while as a chaplain in the Confederate Army. After the Civil War, his father took a teaching position at the Columbia Theological Seminary, Columbia, South Carolina. So he lived there. So he did. He spent his youth in the South. By background, though, by family background, he wasn't much of a Southerner. And if you're looking for deep roots, he wasn't even much of an American. His mother was born in England, from a Scottish family. His father was born in Ohio. Of his father's parents, his paternal grandparents, were born in Northern Ireland. So he was the only president since Andrew Jackson to have had no American-born grandparents. So recent ethnic extraction. We don't think of Wilson that way, but indeed he is. He lived most of his adult life in the North. In fact, nearly all of it. And he had chances to go back to the South, which he didn't take advantage of, or he chose not to. When it comes to the South and the impact of the South, particularly with we've been concerned with recently, is race, really, racism.
Mm-hmm.
Wilson really was much more closer to being a typical Northern white this period. Now, the distinction there is not that Northerners couldn't be and weren't racist, they certainly could be and were, but the difference was that for Southern whites, most of them, nearly all of them, not just the foaming at the mouth demagogues, but also the genteel ones, race was always there. It's an ever-present concern, often, sometimes right out front, but always lurking in the background. So they're always sensitive to it. It's something that is central to them. And maintaining white supremacy is central to them. For Northerners, it was their problem, the Southerners' problem. And it was like a pesky distraction. Let's get on to other things. Wilson is much more of that mindset. And he was proud of being from the South. But on the other hand, he was very insistent when he became president that he was a president for the whole nation. And when newspapers wrote about the Dixified flavor, they said, of his administration, because a number of his closest advisors and appointees were from the South, he didn't like that. He didn't like that at all. He said, "I'm president for all the people. I'm representing the whole country." He did not want that. So I think that's something that needs to be borne in mind.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. I mean, many times when people will talk about Wilson, they'll always say, "Oh yeah, he was really racist," or "Oh, he had issues with race," and as if that was the only thing in his life and his presidency, which is I think not the whole picture at the very least. And so I'm firmly agreeing with what you're saying. He goes to law school, and the practice of law just wasn't the right fit. You talk about this in the book. Was that because he was just more academic and intellectual, and as you can see, he was obviously the president of Princeton and things like that? Was he more designed for that kind of world as opposed to actually doing law, or what was the kind of deal there?
What he didn't like was the practice of law as a beginning shingle hanging young lawyer in Atlanta. The kind of stuff he was going to do was going to be pretty ordinary, humdrum stuff. not intellectually challenging. And yes, indeed, he was, Wilson was an intellectual. No two ways about it. He, Theodore Roosevelt, Barack Obama, they are our post-Civil War presidents who were genuine intellectuals. And indeed, he wanted that. But his first ambition was to be, as he said, a statesman. He wanted to go into politics from the very beginning. And when he left the law, he believed that he was forsaking that. But okay, because what he wished, and one book I wrote earlier was a comparative biography of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. What Woodrow Wilson would have loved to have had, dearly loved to have had, was the kind of entree into politics that Theodore Roosevelt had. That is, the wealth, the social position, that kind of thing, so that he could get right in, not exactly at the top, but could get right into serious politics where you're dealing with more important issues, not just local sewage and zoning and things like that. And because Theodore Roosevelt, right out of Harvard, a year or two out of Harvard, he's in the New York Assembly, and then when he's 30, he runs for mayor of New York, and then he's assistant secretary of the Navy. He's police and governor and war hero, of course. But that Wilson dearly would have loved to have had that kind of entree, and he believed that if he had to stick around and do that unborn practice of law, that would just grind his mind down, and by the time he might be able then to work his way into politics and slowly up the ladder, he said, my mind wouldn't be any use for it anymore. So what he wanted to do, though, he was never satisfied with being just an academic. He wanted, his belief was when he went in, he actually said, he says this in a wonderful letter to his fiancée, that he wanted to be an outside force in politics. In other words, he conceived of what we would now call a parapolitical career, being an advisor, being perhaps an appointed official, kind of in and outer, the kind of thing that Henry Kissinger, speaking of Brzezinski, did 100 years later in foreign policy. He had that in mind. The interesting thing is, though, he found academic life that much more absorbing. He did some of that. He never had, he commented, but he was not, he was much less engaged in day-to-day politics. He followed it. He believed that he should. He believed that every educated, decent person should be a good citizen and inform himself, because we're talking about a male electorate then, himself and do that. And that's what he instilled in students at Princeton very much. This is what you should do. But he's not following everything compulsively all the time. What his academic background gave him, I think it was a great advantage in politics, which still, for some reason, you just don't seem to appreciate it enough. He gave him a real sense of the larger purposes and also of how things really worked. Interestingly, his really one really good book was Congressional Government, his first book. And 10 years after he published it, he got to know, slightly, the Speaker of the House, and Thomas Reed. And Reed said he was absolutely amazed at how well Wilson understood it. He got it without being. So that was remarkable. So he had a sense of a broader sense of how to do it. And then what he did, when his presidency at Princeton turned out to be a train wreck, not his own fault, but he got a second chance. In other words, here, all of a sudden, that first love that he wanted to follow, politics, opens up for him. So that he had made the jump very quickly, very smoothly, very successfully. And he's a guy, since he was the son, grandson, son-in-law, nephew of Presbyterian preachers, always preaching, he got a chance to practice what he'd been preaching, to put into effect the ideas and the approaches that he had developed and refined. And it worked. I think it worked extraordinarily.
I want to ask you about congressional government because I also find that book fascinating. Just as a kind of a footnote here, is it wrong to make too close of an association or comparison with Wilson's kind of scholastic, academic, intellectual kind of mode with kind of many of the things that we saw with President Barack Obama? There seem to be a lot of similarities, or is that too close?
Oh, I think that's quite clear. In fact, somebody else has written another book about Wilson recently, in which she really, without coming out and saying it, is that he suffered from what Obama supposedly did. He wasn't enough of a schmoozer. He wasn't didn't do that kind of thing. So detached. I don't think that's wrong. Our models of the strong president are based upon somehow can't quite get Ronald Reagan into it. They're based upon Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, and a good dash of Theodore Roosevelt. Lost him. That is a constant, absorbed, in the case of TR and LBJ, hyperactive, hands-on, more than hands-on, even meddling, micromanaging. Wilson's not that.
Yeah.
But I think if you look at his success, especially as domestic president, he ranks with FDR and LBJ as the three great legislative presidents. Certainly since the Civil War, really had to expand that. But there's a different model. There was a model of he would set the direction, set the goals, set the agenda. Then he treated his cabinet members like responsible adults. People who, that's why they were there, because they supposedly knew their people, knew it better than he did. Wilson was very good about, I think it's a real contrast to the other three models. He was always aware of what he didn't know, and would seek out that, and he would set these goals. Now, that's in domestic affairs. Foreign affairs is another story. It's a story from the very beginning, very well. But I think it's certainly a very successful and I think a very attractive model of how somebody can be a strong, effective president.
I do want to ask about congressional government. We can just real quick on this. I mean, it's an incredible book. I mean, he talks about how checks and balances maybe were outmoded. How did he view centralized federal government and how there needed to be changes to the House and the Senate and the presidency? It really was almost like a full redress of many ways in which we do things. Yeah,
one of his approaches and insights. First of all, one was, how does government work? That's all wrong, of course. Isn't that what they always study? Well, no, actually they didn't. Political science was just emerging as a true discipline. Up to this point, it had been the study of law and institutions. And that was how, you're studying how it was supposed to work and how the forms. And he, as an undergraduate at Princeton, he discovered the writings of an Walter Bagehot, who said, no, let's look at how it really works. It's like the Emperor's New Clothes in the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. Let's look at how it really works. And from there, Wilson then got into, not really saying so, but got into comparative government. In other words, how does our system stack up against a parliamentary system, which is dovetail, merged powers? And his answer to that was, ours doesn't stack up as well. Now, here's something too. His mother was born in England. His whole background is Scotch-Irish. Yeah, and in some ways, of course, he was an Anglophile. Most cultured white people of that time were Anglophiles in the United States. Wordsworth and Shakespeare and Trollope and Dickens and so forth. But that's not what informed him about seeing the parliamentary system as being superior. It was a very, very impersonal thing. Let's measure both of them by standards of how effective they are and how accountable they are. And by those standards, our system just didn't stack up as well. So what he wanted to do and what he advocates, not too much preaching there, he pulled back from that. He realized that was not the way to write the book. But what can we do to bridge the separation of powers? You're absolutely right, Xavier. He never liked the separation of powers. Even though he was a Democrat and was from the South, or had by background from the South, and that meant, of course, the God of gods for them is Thomas Jefferson. And that's separation, limited government, and so forth. Wilson very early rejected that. And in fact, he said privately several times, or actually, and even I think in some of his writings, that the founder of the founders, his favorite was Hamilton. He even said at one point, writing to a fellow academic, he said, ever since I've been able to have political opinions of my own, I have been a federalist. Now, he meant exactly the opposite of what the Federalist Society is today. He meant, I believe in strong central government. And that's what he pursued. Now, he made intellectual accommodations with Jefferson. When he got into Democratic politics, he had to. As I said, I think I said in there that if he was going to go anywhere in Democratic politics, he was going to have to square himself with two men, one living and one dead. The one who was living was William Jennings Bryan, and the one who was dead was Thomas Jefferson. But each was, I'd say, equally important in becoming a Democratic presidential candidate and president.
Yeah, his book is really, really fascinating, and it's interesting how he approached it and was thinking about that, many years ago.
Well, he started that. He started that while he was still in college.
Mm-hmm.
Published his first article, a magazine article, journal article, while he was a senior at Princeton. And by the way, that was not a senior thesis. Princeton didn't have the senior thesis requiring for another 50 years. But this is something he did. He decided and got it published in a journal in Boston, which was edited by a fellow then who was a young instructor at Harvard, named Henry Cabot Lodge. And shall we say their paths crossed?
Yes, they did. That's very funny. I'm going to skip over a little bit of his time as president of Princeton and then governor of New Jersey, only for time, although those are some really interesting parts of his life, mostly of how fast he rose. But I do want to talk about the infamous election of 1912. I know there's books been written on this. Much ink has been spilled on this, wild election.
Why did you call it infamous?
What's that?
Why did you call it infamous?
Well, because it really seems to be the election that was kind of the microscope was on progressivism at the time. And you couldn't really find, you have to really split hairs of what were the differences between TR in the Bull Moose Party and his progressivism, and Wilson with his progressivism, and Taft had his whole deal as well, which wasn't quite as fine of a detail. But it really was a lot of those types of themes, which is, antitrust and unions and things.
Yeah, William Allen White, great American journalist, and one of the greatest people ever had. Mm-hmm. Very close to TR, in on that campaign. Right after Wilson died, 12, 13 years later, said between the new freedom and the new nationalism, that Wilson's new freedom, TR's new nationalism, was the fantastic imaginary gulf that has always existed between Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Right, and most historians have followed that. I don't agree with it. I think, yes, if you look at what they advocated in specific issues, specific measures, specific reforms, there is a great deal there's a great deal of overlap. And, George Wallace back in 1968 would say there's not a dime's worth of difference between anyway. There's not a dime's worth of difference between. Well, one of my favorite lines from Moby Dick is when Captain Ahab is trying to explain why they're going after the white whale, and his mate Starbuck, coffee house, saying, "Captain, what's this going to get us on the Nantucket market? What profit is there? Profit, money profit is in this case. A little lower layer, Mr. Starbuck. Let's get a little lower into this." That's what I see here. Yes, but there are two very different visions at work there. I mean, I think I've even compared this. I think I did in the book to the Russian Matryoshka doll. The open one, and there's another. So where do you finally get to the one that's the core there? And I think the core isn't comparative. Which one was more sweeping legislation and so forth. No, I don't think that. A little bit of difference in their attitude toward bigness and business per se, a little bit of that, but not too much of that. Where it is, and it's not, by the way, what's fascinating is it's not over the size and strength of government. In fact, the major debate between the two of them was over big government and who was the more sincere champion of big government. TR goes after Wilson very early and saying he's a sham progressive. He's back in the old flintlock states' rights era. He's not a real progressive, and I am, and that's what we need for these times. Wilson had no trouble at all refuting, partly because he was, of course, such a skilled orator and debater, but mainly because it wasn't true. I mean, remember, Hamilton. This is the guy who had admired Hamilton ever since then. So ultimately, I think it comes down to, for me, this is the essence of the difference between liberalism and conservatism. Liberalism is based upon an optimistic view of human nature. That is, people, if they're given a chance, if they're given an opportunity, level playing field, always constrained by rules and laws and morals, of course. But if you do that, if you let them do their own things, it will produce a good society. It will produce social good. The conservative basically sees human nature as flawed, depraved might be a little too strong, but in other words, it goes back to original sin. So that if you're going to have a good society, people are going to have to, you're going to have to do something to it. Now, most of the time with conservatives, it is repression. It is people have to be hemmed in, repressed, led by the nose. There's another way to do it too, though. And this is what Theodore Roosevelt comes around to, is preaching. And by the way, he's the one, bully pulpit is his term. And he's the one, not Wilson, who compared leadership to preaching. What you do is you evangelize. Through evangelism, you lift them up with a vision of something larger than themselves, and to use the Christian term, they become born again. I think that's what it came down to. In fact, I think this was in some ways, not the infamous election. I think this is, in terms of sheer intellectual depth and sophistication, this is the best campaign we've ever had. Ever. And I never say never, but I haven't seen anything like it since then. Sometimes it gets better, but there are lots of reasons, and we have not had that yet. But no, this was, I think this was, in terms of intellectual depth and sophistication, in American presidential elections, this is as good as it gets.
That's a marvelous way in which you describe it, and really kind of getting at the core of what it was about this election that was super important. In the end, obviously.
By the way, two things that,
yes.
When we 1912, which also open out to other things. Mm-hmm. One is one of the things that TR and Wilson competed over was Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Lincoln. And for Wilson, Lincoln is the apotheosis of the self-made man. In other words, here is the supreme example that no matter how lowly you were born, if you got the right stuff, you get the right chances, you can realize there's no limit. For TR, it's Lincoln, the defender of the Union, the man who the nation was the most important thing. And he saw both the abolitionists and the secessionists as a plague of both their houses. They're the ones that are trying to eat, each in his own way is willing to destroy the Union. And this is the higher vision that you have to inspire people to follow. What's missing there, of course, how about that? Neither one of them talks about Lincoln as the great emancipator. Race is almost non-existent as an issue, as a major issue being discussed and debated over in that election. The other thing that's missing is foreign affairs. Remember, this is less than 2 years. This election is less than 2 years before the outbreak of World War I. Mm-hmm. Only candidate of all of them who even mentioned foreign affairs briefly was, not surprisingly, Theodore Roosevelt. He does, in one speech, he gives passing mention to we need to have a strong armed forces in order to play our great role in the world. This is something that, of course, he had preached about so much as president. Yeah. He really believed in this, but passing mention, so that it's just before World War I, nobody's paying any attention to that.
It's really interesting that you bring up Lincoln. I recently read a book by John Avlon called Lincoln and the Fight for Peace. And there's a chapter at the end where he talks about Lincoln's kind of legacy in the 20th century and how he mentions Wilson and this election. It is quite interesting you bring that up.
Lincoln, by the way, he was a model for both of them. I Wilson tremendously admired Lincoln. Never mind that stuff. Democrat versus Republican, tremendously admired Lincoln. TR, I think you could say, almost idolized Lincoln. For him, Theodore Roosevelt, left the White House a disappointed man because he basically, with certain interesting exceptions, presided over what we call now an ordinary time. There's no great crisis, no great war especially. And in one speech he gave soon after leaving the presidency, he said, a great leader needs great events, needs a great crisis. And he said, where would Lincoln have been if it hadn't been for the Civil War? That, I think, is one reason, a key, maybe the most important key to understanding this absolute blood feud vendetta that TR conducted against Wilson. This was the moment. This was the greatest moment in centuries, the greatest crisis. And Theodore Roosevelt, of course, saw it as, in many ways, his crisis, the kind of thing that he was better equipped to deal with than any other American, and to play a great role. And he wasn't there. He couldn't do it. Instead, you had this man who, the relationship between the two of them is interesting too, because they had liked and admired each other for a long time. They sort of got to know each other a bit and felt each other out and really, really liked each other until Wilson begins to get his toe into politics, and then of course 1912 they're competitors and rivals then. But no, this it's sad. It's very, very sad to see how carried away Theodore Roosevelt got with that. But it is an awful lot of that has to be written off. Now there are plenty of issues and plenty of approaches that there's more to it, but it's jealousy is a lot of it. And we as a psychological principle, we always modify jealousy with the adjective petty. We have petty larceny and grand larceny. And I think there is such a thing as grand jealousy. That's what it was.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So he ends up winning the election, and the first term is very heavy on the domestic side. So I'll give you some runway here and just give us the main defense of why he's so great. I think a lot of it has to do with domestically in the first term, but just as a to tee you up here, you had the Simmons bill for tariffs. You have banking reform with the creation of the Federal Reserve, or basically our central bank. You had the Clayton antitrust bill and Federal Trade Commission, income tax, all of these things. So maybe just kind of tell us how these all happened, how he got these passed, and how this was, still tremendous for us in American society.
Well, what he did was he did what he had done. He had a trial run at this. He was dress rehearsal as governor of New Jersey, and he did something as governor that nobody had ever done before. He drew up a legislative program in advance, and then went and worked with his party. Wilson was very much the theorist and then the practitioner of party government. He did a political party. That's the way. That's the vehicle by which we can bridge the separation of powers. We can get these branches of government working together. We can get the government working in one direction with one purpose. So he'd done that in New Jersey, so he repeats it. In other words, he lays out the legislative program in advance. You mentioned the big three. That's of the first 2 years. The tariff, which is accompanied by the income tax, the Federal Reserve, and then antitrust and Federal Trade Commission. Those are the big three. And he worked hand in glove with his Democratic leaders in Congress, especially the ones in the House. He really, the committee chairs, the majority leader, so much the speaker, that was Champ Clark, a defeated rival for the presidential nomination, sulked in his tent for most of the time. But he did that, and he kept at it. What he did also was he called Congress into session in April. This is the 320th Amendment, the old crazy old system they had, which went back to horse and buggy days. He called him into session a month after the inauguration, and immediately called for the tariff reform, hit that. And what he did was absolutely unheard of. He kept Congress continuously in session. It was a kind of a technical break, but that Congress that started in April of 1913 doesn't adjourn until October 1914. That had never happened. Congress had never stayed that long in continuous session, not even during the Civil War. What he did was he kept them at the job. And the political cartoonists, of course, given his background, they love to portray him as a schoolmaster and the mortarboard hat and the gown and everything. So what you've got, they portray him as the schoolmaster with the ruler, with these congressmen as being these itchy, recalcitrant boys that he's keeping them at their desk, keeping their noses to the grindstone. So a lot of that. Woody Allen's so much as just showing up. Well, he made them show up. He wouldn't let them off. Interestingly, though, those are the first 2 years, and that's what's generally known and regarded as the New Freedom Bill. There's a second shot, though, and this comes, by the way, after largely with a big exception of Mexico. He's undistracted for the first year and a half of his presidency, largely by foreign affairs. That was domestic. You can make the domestic priorities. Mexico is a big exception, but not the way the World War became. So he did that. But in 1916, there is a second episode of renewed freedom. What you have there is you have the inheritance tax, the first federal inheritance tax. Mm. You have a federal child labor law. Mm-hmm. It was struck down by the Supreme Court. Federal aid to farmers. A labor law, the 8-hour law for railroad workers. This is the first federal legislation of its kind. It is the precursor, the opening wedge for wages and hours legislation. And by the way, a Supreme Court nomination, Louis Brandeis. Now, that's significant in a number of ways. It's often pointed out that this is the first Jewish person to be nominated for the Supreme Court. He also, Brandeis was extremely controversial because he was the great progressive lawyer and beloved in many progressive circles and absolute anathema among conservatives. Mm. I've often said that was, to compare that, if you wanted a comparison to more recent history, it's as if either Carter or Clinton had nominated Ralph Nader for the Supreme Court. I mean, that's the kind of chocolate itself either.
Yeah.
But the other thing was, he was nominating one of the greatest justices we've ever had. I mean, yeah. This tower, the towering. So that's the second. What had happened was in the midterms, guess what? It's supposed to be the law of politics. The president's party suffers. The Democrats lost seats in the House. They actually gave it to the Senate. They lost a lot of seats in the House. A lot of that was because TR's progressive party. So it was back to straight out two-party competition. So they had much diminished majorities. And a lot of his advisors said, Mr. President, you got to go slow, you got to rein this in and be careful. Wilson, more progressive, full steam ahead on progressives. And the 1916 election, which you know say it's about he kept us out of war, as in most presidential elections, the most important issues were domestic. And they were domestic progressive issues. And it really was pretty much the Democrats as the progressives and the Republicans as the conservatives, getting back really to their McKinley years.
It's really interesting how he was able to accomplish so much in the first term domestically. I want to move to the second term and mostly just talk about foreign affairs because that's where a lot of that happens. Just real quick, just because we mentioned it earlier. It's again about race, and so obviously there was. We don't have to spend too much on this, but there was a lot of things in the presidency that people critiqued him on, namely the screening of Birth of a Nation in the White House, and somewhat sympathetic about KKK members. Was there any shutting him out or shutting folks out from certain governmental elected offices and certain discrimination, things like that?
His worst sins come right at the beginning. He were a number of Southern cabinet and they came in and said, Mr. President, our folks down south, white folks, are really upset because you've got black men bossing white women in the federal workforce, which actually was not true, but that's what they upset about. And we need to clean this up. We thought it would be a good thing to introduce segregation, formal segregation, into the workplace. Well, Wilson, who was a term of discredit, said, well, okay, if you think that's necessary, if you think that will help, go ahead and give it a try. They did. And it failed, partly because some of it was just unworkable with offices, agencies, but also because there's a new organization, the NAACP, which organized a lot of big protests. So they pulled back on it. Now, informally, federal workplace was, but also as these Southern cabinet secretaries started reducing the number of African Americans employed and degrading them, putting them into less important jobs.
Mm-hmm.
That was bad. There's no question about it. And interestingly, that doesn't begin to change another 20 years until the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. Because when the Republicans came back in the 1920s, they did not undo any of this. This continued in course. Now, you mentioned Birth of a Nation. That was, Wilson had been at Johns Hopkins in grad school and had known the novelist, the scurrilous racist novelist Thomas Dixon, who wrote the books The Birth of a Nation based on.
Right.
And Dixon had appealed to Wilson on the basis of this old acquaintance. And movies are a new industry. It's helping new industry. And Wilson's a movie buff. He liked movies. So Wilson himself was not too involved in it. His secretary, Joe Tumulty, said, "Okay, Joe, handle this." And he did. Wilson, we have an eyewitness. Many years later, the great editor, Arthur Link, interviewed the last surviving person on an older woman. And she said, the president seemed rather distracted in the whole movie. He sat there, seemed rather distracted, and when it was over, he just went and left. So that notion that he has this endorsement of it, history written by like, and so forth, that was invented by a Hollywood writer 20 years later. I think he never said that. Later, Wilson actually tried to have a reissue of a reshowing of Birth of a Nation suppressed. In other words, he tried to say, no, that upsets people too much. It upsets our Negro brethren too much. We don't want to do that. And he distanced himself after that. Now, that, of the things I find it interesting is that the thing that he has such a name, Black Americans, for Birth of a Nation, which is that's a kind of one-off thing. The segregation of time, I think that's he should be criticized and condemned for things, and that's what it should be. But that's what that.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So we stay out of World War One for a while. He didn't want to. He wanted to be neutrality, and then we finally get into World War One. So what was the kind of just brief arc of staying neutral, not getting involved after second term? We get into World War One towards the back end of it. What was the kind of arc of that?
Originally, a war of this magnitude is going to affect us. I mean, as much as we prize our tradition of isolation and see the Atlantic Ocean as a great boat that separates us, it was going to have effects. And it certainly had the effects. The main effect originally was the British blockade, which affected various American exports. The British handled it pretty well, though. They mitigated that. They bought up a lot of things, and they handled that pretty well. The Germans, of course, used the submarine. And the difference was the British blockade hurt American commerce. We had Americans in the pocketbook. That's not good, but that can be made up, particularly with these international claims that you have going, these international courts of claims after wars. And okay, the submarine, on the other hand, kills people. Lives are lost. And the great turning point for American consciousness, public consciousness of the war, concern about the war, is the sinking of the Lusitania. I mean, that is, I think, the closest precursor model for 9/11. It was something that was happened, and it was, well, course, it was one of the largest structures, physical structures in the world, like the World Trade Centers. It also involved the fastest means of transportation, then, in that case, ocean liners. And it was just, it was the shock of recognition. Oh my God, this does touch us. And what do we do about it? And Wilson stated it rather well, that his task and his dilemma was, he said, the American people have a double wish. They want to get satisfaction over this from Germany. In other words, our national honor and safety of the Americans who may be traveling on these ships, honor on one side. But they want to do nothing that will get us involved in the war. So it's the old one of peace with honor. Wilson conducts a long, I call it something like a extreme slow motion fencing match, back and forth diplomatically. Eventually, in the spring of 1916, he put it to the Germans, rein in the submarines, or we'll break diplomatic relations. And the clear implication is that's a central war. The Germans backed down. They backed down, and World War I, the danger of being involved in World War I was, I like to use our cancer conscious term, was in remission. It's in remission from the spring of 1916 until the Germans unleash the submarines at the beginning of February 1917. So it's in remission. And he kept us out of war. That interesting Democratic campaign slogan. That referred to Mexico. That was not Europe, it was Mexico. And there, Wilson, I think, deserves a lot of credit. He was being pushed hard from Republicans and some Democrats. Americans are getting killed down there, American property is being destroyed, and so forth. And he was absolutely determined that if we could all possibly avoid it, not to get involved. I don't know where, I looking back at his earlier writings and everything, I don't know where this came from, but he had come to believe that the Mexican-American War of the 1840s had been a crime against Mexico. This was a war that we had provoked and that we had pursued unjustly, and he was not going to do that again if he could possibly avoid it. And when he sent Pershing down on that punitive expedition to try unsuccessfully to catch Pancho Villa, Pershing was under very strict orders not to expand this, not to have what we call now mission creep. In other words, they were really trying their darndest not to make this a full-scale invasion. Right?
And it's really interesting about World War I, which is has been getting a little bit more recognition, or I guess it's been studied a little bit more and more recently. And obviously, the more recent film not too long ago came out, and some people's interest peaked. And so, after the war, during and after, he dedicates his time for peace. And so, just briefly, it's the 14 points, and then the League of Nations.
Well, what he done? He realized that this remission to the submarines was tenuous and might not last, that danger might come again. He also had become more and more horrified, genuinely, deeply horrified by the carnage and the slaughter of the war, and that this just not only did we have to end this war, but we had to try to create a new international order, situation, methods, so this wouldn't happen again. So he actually starts, before we went into the war, his great speech in January 1917, where he called for peace without victory, which would be a compromised, non-punitive peace, and one that would be guaranteed and enforced by a League of Nations, an international organization that would be empowered to enforce peace through various ways. I mean, military force would be the ultimate one, but diplomatic sanctions, economic sanctions, all this should sound terribly familiar to us now. That's so what he did was, and he wanted to do this, mediation. He wanted to mediate the war, bring them together, and create this. Well, the Germans pulled that out from under him by unleashing their submarines. So basically what he did was he still pursued the that kind of non-punitive peace guaranteed by the future League of Nations through war. It's and then it's paradoxical, but that's what he was trying to do. He fought an unlimited war. I mean, and Theodore Roosevelt said, "Oh, we'll fight a feeble war." He won't really get into it. No. That misjudged Wilson. Wilson, we were going to fight, put everything we had into it, and we did. But in some ways, an unlimited or not very limited war, but for limited ends, not for a sweeping victory. He thought a sweeping victory would be a terrible thing. So that's what comes through then with the League of Nations. And the 14 points, that was his, in some ways, that is the closest equivalent to a peace without victory. And it's aimed at several different audiences. I mean, one is in the Allied powers, particularly the trades unions, left-wing parties were getting very tired of the war, questioning why this was going on. This was to rally them to a truly decent liberal peace. It was also to try to keep the Bolsheviks who come to power in Russia prevent them from making a separate peace with the Germans. If that didn't work, but I think his main target above those was Germany. Was to say, hey, look, here's the kind of peace you can have. We had not quite got, well, we were in the war, but our first troops in any numbers were just beginning to arrive on the Western Front. And the Germans also, now that they had gotten the Russian out of the war, that they had cleared their Eastern Front, that they'd won there, now could do what they wanted to do from 1914 on, was to throw everything on the Western Front. And this last great offensive that they were going to do. What Wilson's trying to say is, don't do that. This is the kind of peace you can have. And when they spurned this, he got carried away briefly. One of his speeches, it sounds like Theodore Roosevelt, force without center limit is our answer. He got over that pretty quickly. And then from there, of course, it's going to Paris and the peace negotiation. And the tragedy of the failure of the League of Nations for us to join the League.
Yeah.
Which his health, that's where the stroke that he suffered. Nobody can say, and I won't say that things would have turned out better and fine if he hadn't suffered that stroke. I think you can say, though, of course they would have turned out better. I mean, this was a terrible thing. It is the worst incident of presidential disability we've ever had.
Yeah.
And crisis, well, if you can think of a slow motion crisis, that's what it was too. For the last year and a half of his presidency, Wilson was barely functioning. In many ways, we didn't have a president for that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite sad how it resulted towards the end, and I know we didn't talk about his first wife and her death, and then his second wife and how instrumental she was, and then obviously the stroke and stuff. But I want to be mindful of your time, and so the final question I have for you is, what's the legacy of Woodrow Wilson and how he's influenced the office of the president and for folks after him?
Well, he and I think he and Theodore Roosevelt had this in common, is that they brought qualities of mind and of culture to the office and elevated it. I mean, that they really made it into that, show the possibilities of truly enlightened, sophisticated leadership, which, well, the record since then has been somewhat, but there's a standard there. There's a standard. And if we feel disappointed that succeeding presidents haven't lived up to that. We should feel that, because that's a real standard thing. He clearly, when we talk about now trying to defend and restore the liberal world order that emerged at the end of World War II, he set that in motion. He set the example. His historical reputation has gone up and down and up and down. The height of his, at least one time, was during World War II. It's almost like an apotheosis that here was the prophet that we didn't honor, that he told us, he warned us, we didn't honor it. And it's not figuratively. And a lot of it in World War II and after this, we have to make it up to Wilson. The biggest budget, longest running of the reels through time movie that had been made up to that point was not Don McGuire. It was Wilson.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this was, Bill Sherry, the producer, did this deliberately. He wanted, this was his contribution. He wanted to do this. And several of them, all kinds of books, magazine articles, and everything. And some of that got carried away, and I think there are a lot of ways of questioning whether what did emerge with American leadership after World War II was truly Wilsonian, but that's, in some ways, that's quibbling. He was the one who set it forth. And again, wanting to have a world that is safer from aggression, where you have international rules and norms, and that you have the leading nations, particularly one leading nation, willing to enforce this, to make it stick. That's Wilson's legacy, and I think it's a marvelous legacy.
Yeah. Well, the book is Woodrow Wilson, a biography. It's been out for a handful of years. You can get it everywhere. Where's the best places to find you or any of your other work that you have coming out? Any relevant places?
There will be an edition that we're doing. We've still got a little bit of work to do on that. That should be, I hope, within a year or so. I think what we're going to shoot for is the centennial of Wilson's death, which will be in February of 24. And that's these books are available. I won't put any plugs in for Mr. Bezos's organization. Go to your local bookstore. Go to your library.
Yeah. Yes. Of course. Well, look, John, it's an absolute honor and privilege to talk to you. This was really a fantastic conversation, and I'm so glad you came on. So big thanks.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.